My dad glared at me and barked, "Your sister gets the family land, you can leave with nothing." I held up the court notice and shouted, "Keep playing favorites. The judge already ordered every transfer to be frozen." It started with a phone call from the county clerk that I almost ignored. I was sitting in my truck outside a feed store on a Thursday morning, staring at a list of brake parts I could not afford and trying to decide whether I could stretch one more month out of my tires. The clerk said my name, then told me there was a recorded filing involving the land my family had argued about for years. I remember sitting there with the engine off and the cab getting hot, trying to understand why the words transfer, petition, and injunction kept coming up in the same sentence. I had to ask her to repeat it twice. When I finally got the address of the courthouse and the case number, my first thought was that somebody had finally made the mistake I had been waiting for. My second thought was that my dad was going to lose his mind. For most of my life, the land was the one thing in our family that could turn a normal dinner into a disaster. It was 80 acres outside town, not some giant ranch or a wealthy person's estate, just enough property to matter. My grandfather bought it in the 70s. My grandmother kept it together after he died. After her, everything got messy. My dad, Leon, always acted like the land was his by right, even though the deed had never been simple, and a lot of the old paperwork had been shuffled between family members, trusts, and a small stack of documents that nobody wanted to admit they did not fully understand. My sister, Dana, was the favorite. That is the cleanest way I can put it. If you grew up in my house, you could have said it in 100 different ways, but they all meant the same thing. Dana got the extra help. Dana got the benefit of the doubt. Dana got excuses. I got told to be grateful for what I had and stop making things difficult. I used to think that if I worked hard enough and stayed out of trouble long enough, my dad would eventually treat me like an equal. That never happened. Instead, I became the family member who was useful. I fixed fences. I handled paperwork. I drove my dad to appointments when he did not want to pay for a cab. I filled out forms because he hated typing. I made calls because he got angry too quickly and would hang up. I did not mind helping at first. That is the part I keep coming back to because I was not some bitter kid from the beginning. I was 27 when my grandmother died, and I was the one who spent 3 weekends cleaning out the old farmhouse. I found insurance policies in biscuit tins. I found tax notices in kitchen drawers. I found receipts folded into old church bulletins. I also found, tucked in an envelope behind a coffee can full of screws, a copy of the land deed with my name on it. Not as the owner, not even close. But there were signatures, initials, notary stamps, and a handwritten note in my grandmother's shaky script that said she wanted things handled fairly. I brought that note to my dad at the time. He told me I was misunderstanding family business. That phrase became his favorite one whenever he wanted to end a conversation. My grandmother had left behind more than land. She left behind a house that needed work, unpaid property taxes that had been buried under family arguments, and a sentence in a will that my father spent years pretending was vague enough to ignore. Dana moved back in with Dad after her divorce. I moved out of state for work and came back every few months. That was when the land became even more important. Dad started talking about selling off pieces of it. Dana started talking about how she had the kids and needed stability. I started talking about the actual paperwork, which always made the room go quiet for a second before somebody got offended. I should say this now because it matters later. I did not want to take anything from my sister. I did not want to fight my dad for the thrill of it. I wanted the property handled legally so I would not be the idiot who trusted family and then spent the next 10 years regretting it. I had seen what happened when people relied on promises instead of documents. My uncle had done that in another branch of the family and ended up with nothing but a bitter story and a storage unit full of broken furniture. So I kept records. Everything. When I paid for fencing wire, I saved the receipt. When I paid the county tax bill because my dad forgot, I saved the receipt. When Dana asked me to front the cost of a well pump because she swore she would pay me back, I saved the text messages and the bank transfer. When my dad told me he would make it right later, I wrote down the date and the amount in a notebook I kept in my truck. I did not do it out of paranoia, at least not at first. I did it because my family had a long habit of memory turning into mythology. By the time I was 34, the land had become the center of nearly every family argument. Dad said Dana should have it because she was the one with children, and I had no ties there. Dana said I was selfish because I had the money to live elsewhere. I said none of that mattered unless the title changed properly and everyone was honest about it. That was usually the moment Dad would glare at me like I had insulted the family bloodline. He never liked hearing that law had a role to play. He preferred the version where his word was enough. The trouble was that his word kept changing. For years, he told me the land was being held for all of us until things settled down. Then he said he would probably leave it to Dana because she needed it more. Then he said the place was too much work and maybe I should just let it go if I cared about peace. I did not let it go, not because I was obsessed with property, because every time the subject came up, I could feel my grandmother looking at all of us from whatever part of memory she lived in now, and I knew she would have hated the way we were using her hard work to fight over ego. The first real sign that something bad was happening came in March. Dana called me in a panic because Dad had mentioned getting the land appraised. She said he was thinking about signing something over. I told her I would come by that weekend and look at the paperwork myself. When I got there, Dad acted like I was overreacting just by asking. He said he was only planning ahead. He said the property had to be put in someone's name before taxes and maintenance ate it alive. He said Dana had been there helping more than I had. That one stung because it was partly true in the narrowest sense and completely dishonest in the broader one. Dana did help. She also complained the entire time, treated every chore like a personal injury, and still somehow managed to be presented by my dad as the one carrying the family on her back. I asked to see the current deed. Dad told me he did not know where it was. I asked to see the tax record. He said the county had it. I asked whether he had talked to a lawyer. He said if I wanted to act like a lawyer, maybe I should become one. That was the end of that conversation, or so I thought. The next week I got a text from Dana saying Dad had gone to a local attorney with her. She did not say what for. She just sent me the name of the firm and a face emoji that I still do not know how to interpret. I called the office the next morning and asked general questions. I did not lie. I said I was a family member trying to understand whether any documents had been filed involving the land. They would not tell me much, which was fair, but the receptionist did confirm there had been an inquiry about title issues and a possible transfer. That was enough to make my stomach drop. I drove to the courthouse that afternoon and pulled what I could access through public records. It was not the whole story, but it was enough to show me that a quitclaim deed had been prepared. Not recorded yet, prepared, involving my dad and Dana. And somewhere in the paperwork trail, there was a signature block that raised a question about whether my grandmother's old estate language had been followed the way it should have been. I was not even sure yet whether this was stupidity, greed, or something legally worse. I just knew it was not casual. I spent the next 2 nights after work on my kitchen table with a laptop, tax receipts, old bank statements, insurance invoices, and the battered notebook I had been keeping for years. I found patterns I had forgotten I had. Dad had always let me pay certain bills because he said he would reimburse me. He usually did not. When he did, it was months later and never for the full amount. Dana had never paid property tax directly, but she had benefited from improvements I paid for and services I arranged. There were email confirmations from the county showing the taxes were paid from my account 3 years in a row after Dad missed the due date. There was a copy of the well inspection I had paid for after the old one failed. There was the utility bill for the farm trailer, which Dad insisted was temporary but had now become a permanent part of the property discussion. Most importantly, there was the old estate packet from my grandmother. I had almost thrown it away years earlier when I was sorting boxes after her death, but I kept it because something in her note bothered me. The document was not neat. It was one of those family legal arrangements that seemed designed by someone who assumed everyone would get along forever. What mattered was that she had clearly intended the property to be kept within the family until a proper settlement could be made. And there had never been a proper settlement. Just years of arguing, deferring, and pretending that postponing a decision counted as making one. The biggest thing I discovered was not even in the legal packet. It was in the tax records. One parcel on the east edge of the land had been switched into a different mailing address months earlier. Not mine. Not Dad's. Dana's. I stared at that for a long time. It looked small until I thought about what it meant. If somebody had been quietly redirecting notices and correspondence, then somebody had been setting up the paperwork to make it look like Dana had the cleanest claim to the property. I took screenshots of everything. Then I made copies. Then I backed it up to an external drive and emailed it to myself. I was not going to be the guy who lost his footing, because he trusted a family argument to stay verbal. I called a property attorney the next day. I was nervous as hell, which made me sound awkward and probably too cautious, but I laid out what I had. He listened without interrupting, which was more than my family usually did. He told me I needed to bring him the original copies of what I had and any evidence of a pending transfer. He also told me not to confront anyone until he could review the records. I did not promise anything dramatic. I just drove home, sat in my truck for 10 minutes and looked at the house where my dad and sister were living like it was an enemy camp. I hated how petty that thought felt, but I could not shake it. 2 days later, my dad called and told me to come to Sunday dinner. He said we were going to settle the land issue like adults. That should have been the first warning that things had gotten worse. When my dad offered peace, he usually meant a performance. Still, I went. I brought nothing with me except my phone and the court envelope I had not yet opened. I had been called back to the courthouse that morning because my attorney had filed an emergency motion after seeing the documents. He thought the transfer was close enough to move fast. He told me to keep the envelope sealed until I was in front of my father. That was the strangest part of the whole thing. Sitting in my car outside the courthouse, holding a piece of paper that might stop my own family from taking the land out from under me, and realizing how much of my life had been spent trying not to upset people who never worried about upsetting me. By the time I pulled into my dad's driveway, Dana's car was already there. So was my cousin Mark's truck, which I had not expected. And there was a white SUV I did not recognize. I found out later it belonged to the attorney Dad had apparently brought in for the meeting, hoping to corner me before I could do anything about the paperwork. At the time, I just knew the place looked too busy, too staged. The front yard had been mowed unusually neat. The porch light was on even though it was still afternoon, and the windows were open like someone wanted the house to feel airy and casual instead of tense. That was my dad's style when he was trying to make a fight look like a family decision. Inside, the dining room table had been cleared except for a folder, a legal pad, and a pot of coffee nobody was drinking. Dad was sitting at the head of the table like he was presiding over a board meeting. Dana was on his right, arms folded and face already tight with the kind of righteousness she inherited from him. Mark looked uncomfortable, which meant he had probably been told a version of the situation that made him think he was there as support rather than witness. The attorney introduced himself in the clipped way people do when they are trying to sound calm for everybody else. My dad did not waste time. He told me the family land was going to Dana. He said she was the one staying close. He said I had built a life elsewhere and should stop acting entitled. He said I could leave with nothing if that made the process easier. I remember him saying that last part and feeling very little at first, not because it did not hurt, because I had spent so many years being hurt by his favorites that my brain sometimes went cold before my emotions caught up. Dana looked at me like she expected me to shout. Maybe that was what she needed. Maybe if I had yelled back, they could have all gone home feeling justified. Instead, I reached into my jacket and set the sealed court notice on the table. I had been told not to open it until then, so I did it slowly, right there in front of everybody. I unfolded the pages and saw the temporary injunction, the filed petition, and the order freezing all transfers, sales, gifts, or changes in title concerning the land until the court could review the dispute. My dad's expression changed so fast it almost looked fake. I had never seen him register surprise and anger at the same time without trying to hide one of them. I told him the judge had already ordered every transfer to be frozen. I did not raise my voice as much as I wanted to. I just laid the paper flat and pointed to the highlighted language my attorney had marked. The room got very quiet. The attorney from the white SUV picked up the page and read it twice. Dana leaned forward and immediately started saying it had to be a mistake, that this was probably only about some technical filing, that the family could sort it out without dragging it into court. My dad slammed his hand on the table and called it absurd. He said I had gone behind his back. He said I was trying to steal from my sister. That was when I finally looked him in the eye and told him he had already tried to move things behind mine. I told him I had the county records, the tax payments, the correspondence trail, and proof that the land had been positioned for transfer while nobody bothered to include me in a real conversation. I told him I had not even wanted court until I realized the paperwork was being lined up in a way that would have made Dana the clean owner while the rest of us got shoved aside. I was shaking by then, but not enough to stop speaking. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could also see very clearly that my father had not expected me to come prepared. That was the first real win, if I can call it that, not the court order itself. The look on his face when he realized this was not one of those family fights where I would eventually back down just to keep the peace. The attorney tried to salvage the meeting by saying we should all wait for the legal process. Dad would not have it. He started talking over everybody, insisting he had every right to make decisions because he had been the head of the family for decades. He said the land had been kept alive by him. He said I had done nothing but collect papers and act difficult. He said Dana had children and needed security. That line was supposed to shut me up, and for a second it nearly did. Because that was the old trick always. Take a real issue and wrap it in an emotional blanket so the other person feels cruel for asking for fairness. I looked at Dana then and realized she was not surprised by any of this. Not really. Maybe not the injunction, but the direction of it. That was the moment the story started to shift in my head. I had spent years thinking Dad was dragging her along. Now I was not sure. Maybe they were dragging each other. Maybe she had been helping him because she believed the land should be hers. Maybe he had been using her because she was the easier favorite to justify. Either way, the result was the same. I was the one being written out. The attorney for Dad asked to see my documents. I handed over copies, not originals. He glanced at the tax records, the estate paperwork, the payment history, and the county notices I had saved. His face went from professional to annoyed. He could see what I had done. I had built a trail, not a dramatic trail, not some movie-style trap. Just a boring, honest trail of paper that explained who had paid what, who had handled what, and who had quietly benefited from that work without ever putting things in writing. That is the thing people underestimate. Paper is not emotional. Paper does not care whose favorite child you are. Paper just sits there and tells the truth if you keep enough of it. Dad told me I was making this uglier than it needed to be. That almost made me laugh because ugly was the family's default language. I told him I was only making sure nobody could pretend later that they had been surprised. That seemed to hit harder than yelling would have. Mark finally spoke up and said he had no idea the transfer was this far along. He looked relieved to be out of the blast radius, which I did not blame him for. Then he asked very carefully whether the land had actually been signed over already. That was the question that exposed the whole thing. Dad hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but that fraction told me enough. No, not fully signed over, not yet, which meant the freeze mattered, which meant my attorney had been right to act fast, which meant somebody had been trying to finish this quietly before I could get there. I did not know whether to feel angry, sick, or oddly calm, probably all three. Dana started crying after that, although even now I am not sure how much of it was real and how much was reflex. She said she could not believe I would drag the family into court over something that should stay between us. I told her I had spent years trying to keep it between us, and that had gotten me nowhere. She said she was only trying to protect the children. I told her that was fine, but it did not give her the right to take property that was still contested. She said I was acting like a stranger. That one actually hurt more than the rest because it was probably how they had framed me in their heads for a long time. The bad son, the distant brother, the one who cared more about documents than blood. I wanted to tell them how many times I had been there, how many tires I had changed on the side of the road to help Dad, how many family emergencies I had handled, how many times I had stayed quiet because I thought being the calm one would eventually count for something. Instead, I just said the court would sort it out now. That was the cleanest sentence I had all night, and somehow the most powerful. The attorney for my dad asked if we could step outside and discuss settlement. My dad said no. He was too angry. And in a way, I think he needed the fight more than he needed a solution. People like him are often better at conflict than compromise. Once the room could not be controlled anymore, he got louder. He accused me of turning on my sister. He accused me of poisoning the whole family. He said my grandmother would have been ashamed of me. That one landed badly because I knew he only brought her up when he wanted to weaponize memory. I stood there with the injunction in my hand and told him the truth. I told him Grandma would have been ashamed of all of us for letting greed turn a family property into a battlefield. I told him she would have hated that he was trying to rewrite the past just because he preferred one child over the other. For a second, I thought he might come at me. His face got red enough that even Dana stopped talking. But he did not. He just stared at me, breathing hard, as if he was trying to decide whether he could still intimidate me if he waited long enough. He could not. That was the other thing he finally understood. I was not there to beg. I was there to document. The attorney advised everybody to stop speaking until the court hearing. He also said the injunction was serious and not something to ignore. Dad ignored that too, of course. He kept talking about how this was all a misunderstanding and how the family would fix it without a judge. But I could already tell the damage was done, not because of the court filing alone, because he had said the words out loud. Your sister gets the family land. You can leave with nothing. That was no longer a private threat. That was evidence now. After that dinner, I went home and sat in my apartment with the injunction on the table and my hands resting on top of it. I did not feel victorious. I felt exhausted and a little hollow. People imagine moments like that as triumphant. They are not. They are just the point where a long denial finally meets a hard fact. The next few weeks were a strange mix of ordinary life and legal paperwork. I still went to work. I still checked truck routes and ordered supplies and tried not to spend my lunch breaks reading old county forms. But now I was also meeting with my attorney, organizing exhibits, and going through years of bank statements line by line. The more I looked, the more I found. There were checks my dad had signed for things he later said he never approved. There were invoices for repairs he had asked me to handle. There were email chains where he had agreed to reimburse me after harvest season and then simply never done it. There was a pattern of family money being treated like a shared pool when I paid it and like a private matter when I asked about repayment. That was probably the point where I started to get really angry, not because I was losing land, Because I realized I had been used as the responsible one for so long that my responsibility had become invisible. My attorney suggested we file a full accounting request. That meant forcing a closer look at who had paid what, who had benefited, and whether there had been any improper effort to shift the property. I agreed immediately. That is the thing about being calm for too long. Eventually, calm turns into precision. I stopped trying to convince my family I was reasonable. They already knew that. Reason was not the part they wanted from me. They wanted me quiet. The hearing was set for early summer. Before that, the county placed a formal hold on title activity. That itself became a family scandal. Word spread through relatives faster than it should have. Uncles I barely spoke to started texting vague questions. Aunt Cheryl called and said maybe I should just let Dana have it because she had kids and the land would probably be wasted otherwise. I told her I was not letting anyone have anything. I was asking for what the paperwork already said. She went quiet after that. A few people surprised me. Mark called back and said he had looked over the copies I gave him and realized he had been repeating my dad's version without checking anything. He apologized in a clumsy, very male way that sounded half embarrassed and half defensive. I accepted it because it was genuine enough. My cousin Elise, who had always seen through family nonsense better than the rest of us, told me she was glad I finally forced the issue. She said Dad had been talking for years like facts were an inconvenience. She was not wrong. The worst part of all of it was that Dana still believed I was doing this to hurt her personally. Maybe she truly believed that, or maybe she needed to believe it because the alternative was admitting Dad had been setting her up to benefit from something that was not his to hand out. We exchanged a few texts that got nowhere. She claimed I had turned legal because I wanted to punish her. I told her I had turned legal because nobody in the family could seem to handle a conversation without turning it into a loyalty test. That ended the conversation. Around that time, I got my first look at the title history through my attorney's office. That was when the whole thing clicked in a way it had not before. There had been a prior transfer years back that my dad had talked about as though it settled everything. It had not. It had only shifted one layer of ownership while leaving the larger issue unresolved. In plain English, the family had been acting like the land was free for Dad to assign, when in reality the chain of title was tangled enough that no clean transfer could happen without following exact steps. And those steps had not been followed, at least not all of them. One signature looked suspiciously like a copy rather than an original. One notarization date did not line up with the rest of the paperwork. One witness statement was missing entirely. I am not a lawyer, so I am careful about how I say this. But my attorney told me enough to know the records were messy in a way that favored me, not because I had done anything sneaky, because I had been the one person in the family who had kept copies of everything instead of trusting a verbal version. The hearing itself was nothing like what people imagine when they think court drama. No shouting, no dramatic reveal, just a judge, a stack of papers, attorneys speaking in a measured tone, and my father staring at the table like he wanted the walls to absorb him. My dad looked older in court. That surprised me. At home, he always seemed bigger than he was. In a legal room, he just looked like a man who had overestimated how much family pressure could stand in for proof. My attorney laid out the timeline, the payments, the tax receipts, the notice history, the county mail changes, the questioned deed, the fact that the property had been treated as though it could be moved around before the rightful process was finished. Dad's attorney argued it was a family arrangement and that I was making an honest misunderstanding into litigation. That is when my attorney produced the envelope of records I had maintained for years. Not the whole stack at first, just enough. He showed the judge that my payments were regular, documented, and directly tied to the upkeep of the land. He showed that Dana had benefited from work I paid for. He showed that the attempted transfer had occurred while there was still a live ownership dispute. He also pointed out that the order to freeze transfers was necessary because once the title moved, it would be much harder to untangle. The judge was not dramatic about it. He did not need to be. He asked direct questions. Who had the authority to transfer? Who had been notified? Why certain notices had been redirected? Why some signatures did not match the older records? Every answer my dad gave seemed to make him look more cornered. Not because he was lying about everything. I think he believed his own version, but belief is not legality. At one point, the judge looked at my dad and asked whether he understood that favoring one child did not create ownership. I had to look down at my hands so nobody would see my reaction. That was the first time somebody outside the family had said the quiet part out loud. The judge did not rule on final ownership that day. That was not how it worked. But he extended the freeze, ordered a fuller accounting, and set the matter for further proceedings with all documentation to be submitted through counsel. In practical terms, that meant Dad and Dana had lost the ability to quietly move anything while they pretended the dispute was still just family tension. In emotional terms, it meant my father could no longer act like the land was already decided. That evening, I got back to my apartment and sat in the dark for a while before turning on the kitchen light. I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I just felt tired in a new way. The first call I got was from my dad. I let it go to voicemail. The second was from Dana, same thing. Then from Mark. He told me in a low voice that Dad was furious and that the whole family was talking. He also said something I had not expected. He said people were starting to ask why the land had been treated like Dad's personal gift when the documents never supported that. That was when I realized something important. The court order was not the whole victory. The real victory was that the story was no longer only my dad's to tell. Once documents were in motion, other people could read them too. And when they read them, the mythology started to fall apart. The weeks after that were ugly in the way family fights usually are. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit they had been wrong. Dad alternated between silence and angry messages through relatives. Dana tried to paint me as bitter and controlling. A couple of aunts acted like I had invented the whole thing just to embarrass the family. But every time somebody tried to pressure me privately, I pointed them to the same thing. The paperwork, the court order, the accounting request, the fact that no transfer could happen while the dispute was active. I stopped defending myself emotionally and started answering with facts. That changed everything. My father could argue feelings all day. He could not argue the county record. He could not argue the payment history. He could not argue that he had tried to hand the land to Dana before the ownership questions were resolved. And when the property records were finally pulled in full, the mess became impossible to hide. There had been years of informal arrangements nobody had bothered to straighten out. Some of that was laziness. Some of it was deliberate. My attorney suspected that Dad had assumed I would never challenge him because I usually did not yell. He was probably right. What he did not understand was that calm people tend to keep more evidence. By midsummer, the court had enough to push the family toward a formal settlement discussion. That was when my dad finally looked scared. Not angry, not loud, scared. I saw it in the hallway outside the attorney's office while we waited for the mediation session to begin. He looked at me like I had become someone he did not recognize. That part hurt more than I expected. I still loved him, which made the whole thing worse. I did not want to ruin him. I wanted him to stop lying by omission and stop pretending fairness was a betrayal. The mediation was long and miserable. Dana cried at least twice. Dad tried to posture and failed. My attorney stayed calm and kept returning the discussion to numbers, records, and legal reality. At one point, Dad finally admitted that he had assumed Dana would get the land because she was the one he thought would keep the family close. That was the closest he came to honesty. He said it like it was a practical decision. Maybe he truly believed it was. The mediator asked whether he had ever intended to compensate me for the work I had done over the years. My dad did not answer right away. That silence said more than anything else. In the end, the settlement did not look like what my father wanted, and it did not look like I had originally hoped either. That is probably the most realistic part of this whole thing. Court does not hand you back the past. It just forces people to acknowledge it. The final agreement recognized my contributions, placed the property under a clean legal structure, and prevented the one-sided transfer my dad had tried to make. Some portions of the land were eventually partitioned under terms that required appraisal and compensation. Dana did not get the whole thing. My father did not get to hand it to her like a prize. And the accounting forced the family to confront several years of unpaid obligations that had been brushed aside as brotherly duty. I got reimbursed for a chunk of what I had fronted. Not all of it, enough to matter. More importantly, I got my name on the pieces I had actually preserved and funded through documented work. That was the part I cared about most. Not revenge, not humiliation. Just record and reality finally lining up. The family fallout lasted longer than the legal stuff. Dad barely spoke to me for a while. When he did, it was clipped and angry, like even normal sentences cost him too much pride. Dana went from furious to distant to defensive all over again. She never fully admitted she had known more than she said, but I also think she believed she was protecting herself and her kids in the only way she knew how. I am not pretending she was some mastermind. I think she was trapped in the same family logic as the rest of us. That does not make her right. It just makes her human. Mark was one of the only relatives who kept talking to me normally. He said the whole thing had made him rethink how much family history was really just Dad controlling the narrative. Elise came by once with takeout and a bottle of cheap whiskey and told me she was glad somebody finally made the family stop treating the truth like an annoyance. I laughed for the first time in months, not because the situation was funny, because I was so relieved to be around somebody who did not make me explain basic reality. The strange thing is that the biggest emotional shift happened months later, not during the court filing or the hearing. It happened when I drove out to the land alone one evening after everything was mostly settled. The sun was dropping and the grass along the fence line was taller than it should have been because I had not had time to mow the west edge. I walked the property with the court papers folded in my back pocket and realized how much of my life I had spent trying to earn a place in a family that confused obedience with love. The land looked the same. That was almost insulting. All that fighting and nothing about the dirt itself had changed. The fence was still leaning in the same place near the old oak. The pump house still made that rattling sound when it kicked on. The south corner still flooded after rain. The only thing that had really changed was who could lie about it now. I stood there a long time and thought about my grandmother. I wish I could say I felt proud in that moment. Mostly I felt sad. Sad that she had worked so hard. Sad that my father had become the kind of man who could say one child deserved everything and another deserved nothing. Sad that it had taken a judge for the family to stop pretending. But I also felt something steadier underneath that. I felt like I had finally stopped bending myself around other people's demands. I had not won because I outmaneuvered them. I won because I saved the receipts. I kept the emails. I took the call from the county clerk. I went to the courthouse. I did not explode when they tried to humiliate me in front of everyone. I let the order speak for itself. That is not glamorous. It is not dramatic in the way people like to imagine justice. But it works. A few months after the settlement, I got a letter from my dad. Not an apology exactly. He was too proud for that. It was more like a reluctant acknowledgement that things had gone further than he expected and that the family had been damaged by all of it. He did not admit favoritism, not directly. But he said he had believed he was doing what was best for the people around him. That might be true. It might also be the oldest excuse in the world. I wrote back and told him I was willing to keep things civil, but only through proper channels and only with clear agreements. I told him I was tired of proving I existed only when he needed help. He never answered that one. That was fine. The silence was honest enough. Today the land is still in the family, just not in the chaotic way it was before. There are legal boundaries now. There is an actual structure. There are records where there used to be assumptions. Dana and I are not close, and I do not pretend otherwise. Sometimes we text about practical things. Sometimes we do not talk at all. Dad and I are better than we were, but not healed in some neat movie way. Real life does not give you that luxury. What it does give you is clarity, and clarity, in my experience, is worth more than being the favorite. I still keep the files, not because I think I will need them again, though maybe I will. I keep them because they remind me that truth does not care how loudly somebody shouts over it. My dad learned that in a room full of people when I held up the court notice and told him the judge had already frozen every transfer. He looked at me like I had betrayed him. I looked back and realized I had simply stopped letting him rewrite the facts. That was the day the family story changed. Not because I was angry enough to tear it apart, because I was patient enough to let the paper do the talking. And for once, the paper won.